Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 6 of the Curse of Palmyra. So if you haven't watched parts 1 through 5, you can pause it right here, watch those and get back with us. First order of business is the copyright disclaimer here. Second order of business is this is a true crime series and it's not suitable for children. And finally, this video is my opinion. Opinions aren't facts. I know my viewers are smart enough to recognize that they can do their own research in order to best form their opinions. And with all that out of the way, let's get into it. So Stephanie Stearns is on trial for the murder of Eleanor Muff Graham. And Stephanie's brother was footing the legal bills. And she had Vincent Bugliosi and Leonard Wineglass as her attorneys. And Bugliosi had began meeting with Stephanie and found that she had, quote, a disarming little girl quality, and he found her to be detached, an enigma. This is all stuff from his own book about this case. Stephanie told Vincent Bugliosi that she did not kill Mac and Muff Graham. Bugliosi also mentions in The Sea Will Tell that Stephanie had previously taken 2 polygraphs. Allegedly, the first one was inconclusive and the second one passed, and he got the results of that when he took over the case. Bugliosi recounts how he didn't relish the bad publicity that could come if Stephanie was guilty of such a bloody crime, and that it took multiple sessions with Stephanie to persuade Bugliosi of her innocence. And he says, quote, if someone has committed a terrible crime and you talk to them hour after hour, usually something is going to come up, he said. I just never had a feeling I was talking to a guilty person. This article reads, she assured Bugliosi of her innocence, but more often than not, during the years of preparation for her trial, she was unavailable for strategy meetings. Bugliosi goes into all this lead up to trial a good deal in the book A Sea Will Tell, which I do recommend. But he talks a lot about how he would give her a yellow pad in order to list things favorable and unfavorable about her case, and that she didn't fill it out. Bugliosi writes in The Sea Will Tell how Stephanie ran the maybe Mac did it concept by him. Strangely, this will be later echoed in Buck Walker's own novel that he writes after all this is said and done. Not surprisingly, that concept went over like a lead balloon. Bugliosi was not going to play a maybe Mac did it defense. Bugliosi wrote about how once Muff's remains were found in the box on Palmyra, Stephanie had said it confused her. It confused her. And according to Bugliosi, Stephanie told him that Buck had given her 3 options. 1, to go with him on the Seawind. 2, to go it alone on the Iola. Or 3, to stay on Palmyra alone. Stephanie told Bugliosi that Buck sunk the Iola by opening up all of the Iola's fittings. And also, on another note, keep in mind that that hatch was found on Palmyra. Vincent told her that in order to get her off, they would have to prosecute Buck. Bugliosi also admits in his book that co-counsel wanted to plea bargain Stephanie's case for either second-degree murder or manslaughter, and that Stephanie was considering that, but Bugliosi strongly argued against it. This will come up on another occasion as well. Long story short, there are going to be some differences in the murder trials. Buck went on trial for the murder of Muff Graham and was found guilty. But long story short, the Buck confession to the snitches, we call it the snitch evidence, those cannot be used against Stephanie. And that goes back to Bruton versus the United States. Stephanie would have the 6th Amendment right to cross-examine the witnesses against her. And if Buck isn't taking the stand, and if the snitches aren't taking the stand, basically she has no way to challenge the out-of-court statement made by another defendant. So in the case with Stephanie, you won't have snitches taking the stand saying that she confessed to something. So Wineglass was set to cover the medical and the scientific witnesses, and Bugliosi was basically going to do the rest. Also note there will be no mention of Stephanie Stearns' conviction for the theft of the Seawind. So they had a lot going for them going into it. February 3rd, 1986, Stephanie Stearns, age 39, was on trial for the murder of Eleanor Muff Graham, and it began in San Francisco. The trial was heard by the visiting Honolulu federal judge Sam King. On February 4th, 7 men and 5 women were impaneled to be on the jury, and Inoki did his opening statement, and Wineglass did the opening for the defendant. Many of the same witnesses that appeared at both the boat theft trials and the murder trial of Buck Walker gave much of the same testimony. Jack Wheeler was one of the first witnesses, and he told much the same story that he'd given before about hearing the Iola being bilged out daily as it just remained moored in the lagoon of the atoll. Jack Wheeler testified that he told Stephanie that the trip to Fanning that they were talking about would be, quote, very difficult on the Iola. Edwin Pollock took the stand, and he spoke of the Iola's poor shape, being unseaworthy in his opinion, and he testified that Matt Graham would lock up the cabin on the Seawind every time the Grahams left the vessel. And he also testified as to how Stephanie had changed her story of how she came into possession of the Seawind. Edwin also spoke to how he unlocked the door at the club so that she could use the restroom, and how he heard her flushing away in that restroom until he sent in his wife to get her. Stephanie came out of the stall allegedly with the handbag in her hand. Marilyn Pollock will also testify to this. The illusion that's given is that she had something incriminating, that she was flushing until she was retrieved. And I think this also came up in part on an appeal later on, and I think the court later said that they couldn't determine that there was maybe somebody else in there flushing away too. I could be wrong on this, but the way it's told is he unlocked a door, let her in there, and she was in there for so long that he just asked his wife to go in there and see if she was okay. So I guess no one else would be in there flushing by that token, by that theory. But regardless, the point is made that she was in there flushing for whatever reason, be it she was sick to her stomach, or maybe she was flushing drugs, or maybe she was flushing jewelry. Who the heck knows, right? I mean, she had the Coast Guard after her, the FBI after her, and some of the state authorities after her. So if she had drugs on her, logic would dictate she was probably flushing them, because you know you don't want to be caught even back in those days with even marijuana on you. Marilyn Pollock took the stand and recounted Muff's crying jag to her, and how she said how Muff said, quote, she would never leave the island alive. Marilyn also testified that Stephanie said to her, quote, there's no way I'll leave on the Iola. And Marilyn said that they left early because she was afraid. One witness, Donald Stevens, testified to the condition of the Iola. He thought it was seaworthy, so that was one win for the defense. But he also admitted he never saw the couple on the Graham's boat. Tom Wolfe, another one of the Palmyra witnesses, testified that both couples wanted Palmyra to themselves and were no longer speaking to one another. Wolfe testified that Stephanie told him she was sick of eating coconuts and fish. He also testified to how it would not be easy to bury a body on Palmyra due to the lack of soil. He testified that from where the Iola was moored, one could not see the Seawind. The jury then saw Muff's skull. An anthropologist, a skeletal expert, Dr. Douglas Uberlocker, and medical examiner Dr. Boyd Stevens testified to the condition of the remains. Again, Exhibit 24 was the skull of Eleanor Muff Graham. Uberlocker focused on a whitened area of the skull, and he testified that it was a result of being burned in extreme heat. I also want to note that these photos are older photos. I believe the FBI allowed her remains to be used in demonstrations and stuff, so the pictures in Bugliosi's book are more accurate to the time of the trial. Odontologist Dr. Oliver Harris testified to the blunt force trauma to the molars in Muff's skull and to the jawbone, and he testified that the wound was consistent with a sledgehammer or a large rock, but inconsistent with a fist. The defense attorneys argued that the hole in the skull that some thought could be a gunshot wound, They tried to argue that it was due to natural erosion. The ME, Dr. Boyd Stevens, thought the hole was consistent with the gunshot wound. He said it had very roughened margins associated with coning, and he says, quote, if it was a gunshot wound, then it was a contact gunshot wound. Now, keep in mind that I think Bugliosi said that it could be due to erosion being in the aluminum canister, so he wasn't willing to commit to the gunshot wound. A witness also testified that a .22 caliber pistol could have made the wound, and just note that Buck's pistol was a .22 caliber pistol. Crime lab expert testified to some fabric in the container that had been exposed to, quote, extreme heat or burning, and testified to the wax-like substance in the box that was consistent with a decomposing body being in it. And one witness testified that after analyzing the box, it appeared that the burning time would be estimated at 15 to 20 minutes. So arguably what the jury has heard is that Muff could have been shot, was bludgeoned to the face, possibly cut up with a chainsaw, put in this aluminum box with gas poured in, possibly using an acetylene torch, and set aflame, burning for 15 to 20 minutes on high heat. And eventually this body in the box ends up dumped 100 feet deep in the lagoon. And the only people on the atoll when this seemingly arguably happened were Mac and Muff and Stephanie and Buck. And then after this event occurred, the defendant Stephanie Stearns and her cohort Buck Dwayne Walker show up in Honolulu on the victim's vessel. Now, in his book, Bugliosi is going to talk about some of the evidence that doesn't make its way into the trial. So he acknowledges in his book how ant exoskeletons were found in the bone marrow of Muff Graham's remains, where the bones had been fractured. And this evidence implies that the ants were able to access Muff's remains either before she ended up in the sandy box or after the bones tumbled out of the box and were found by Sharon Jordan. Now keep in mind, the atoll was just riddled with scavengers. Throughout this whole entire series, it's been noted by the different witnesses how like anything left out and about got scavenged by the crabs. So this evidence strongly implies to me, which I'll argue later, that when Muff was murdered and her bones were fractured, she laid on that earth for a period of time that the ants got into those wounds. Not once the bones fell out of the box and then the ants just happened to find the places where the body had originally been fractured, okay? That's my opinion. So Bugliosi had wanted to argue that the ants got into the bone marrow as the bones washed ashore. And he would prove that an ant would go into an old bone for that juicy marrow, okay? He didn't end up needing to go there and address this issue. However, the ants were only in the parts that had been fractured. Just let that sink in. How long did that body sit out? Okay, how long? How long could Stephanie Stearns had not known of a body sitting out? Because in this story, to believe that she didn't do it, like if you truly believe she's innocent, Buck would have had to have done what he did to Mac and Muff very quickly after he killed them and not left a body sitting out. You know, because that was always the thought, is that he did what he did and that he really quickly stuffed them in a box so that Stephanie wouldn't see them, but he didn't do it that fast if the ants were able to get into the wounds. So think about that. Kurt Schumacher took the stand and told the story of the last call with Mac Graham that he had on August 28, 1974, and that how the last people on the atoll were the Grahams and Stephanie and Buck. And he told the story about what's Bugliosi started calling the cake truce incident, with Mac hearing someone approach and then going topside and coming back down and telling Schumacher about them giving him a cake. So I guess there's a truce. And Bugliosi tried to elicit from Schumacher that he only added the cake story to his testimony in later years But then he turned around and just said, well, no one ever asked me specifically about that, and that's why I never told that part of it. After the state rested, the defense started, and William Larson testified that he had only seen friendly relations between the couples, but he admitted that Muff had told him she didn't want Stephanie on her boat, the Sea Wind. Another defense witness, Larry Siebert, who'd been the friend of both Buck and Stephanie, testified that he saw a broken off swordfish fin in the Sea Wind's hull. He said it was between 6 to 8 inches long. He also admitted that he went to the passport office to swear under oath that Buck was Roy Allen. So the state was able to show that Siebert would lie under oath, because when you're taking an oath that someone, Buck Walker, is another person, I mean, that is lying under oath. But, if it truly was a swordfish that pierced Sea Wind's hull, then maybe that bullet testimony doesn't look as viable. But to be honest, that was still Muff dead in that box, and not by natural causes. Bugliosi always made it clear, especially in his book, that the way to get Stephanie off was to put the blame on Buck, where he thought it should be, because he believed in her innocence. But no one was going to believe that they died of natural causes and that Muff ended up in a box, or that Mac did it. So he always said 4 minus 2 equals 2, but he has to prove that Buck did it alone, right? So that was the tack they took. Bugliosi had Stephanie take the stand, and he asked her right away whether she harmed the Grahams, and she said, "I swear by all that I hold dear, I never harmed anyone in my life." She testified how she had turned herself in after she was indicted when the bones were found, how she had been gainfully employed when she'd been on bail. She testified to Buck's love of guns and her aversion of guns and violence. She said she knew of Buck's background, but that she thought she could help him. She described Walker as a very strong person, domineering, a person who liked to have his own way. I guess I'm not one to make any waves. She talked about how Buck had told her about terrible stories from his term in San Quentin, and that he never wanted to return to any kind of prison. And that it was during this time that he planned to flee Hawaii on his own boat, and she decided to go with him. And she also spoke to her mother not being aboard her fleeing with Buck. But, she told her mom that she loved Buck. And so Stephanie denied there was a food shortage on Palmyra, and she denied that she was desperate. And she claimed they only ate 1 meal a day and that she didn't lose any weight while she was on Palmyra. She just denied that they were there desperate for food. And she said the food supply never went below a 7-day supply. Bugliosi brought up her own diary entries, and she claimed that she saw Mac and Muff daily. There was about 23 diary entries that mentioned them, and she spoke highly of the couple while she was on the stand. Bugliosi used Stephanie's diaries to elicit that she had been on board the Sea Wind at least once, and I believe that Buck might have been on the Sea Wind to play chess with Mac once. And she spoke of their plans to go to Fanning after she got that information through Schumacher to Mac that their resupply mission wasn't going to happen. So she said that they were planning to go to Fanning, and that Mac gave them $50 for their generator, and she said that she was just going to either find work on Fanning or sell some of their belongings on Fanning and use that $50. And in my opinion, the diary entries are bunkum. That's just my opinion, because anybody can write anything they want, especially when they have like a month at sea to figure out what you're going to put in a diary entry. But Bugliosi brings up her entry for August 28th. Remember, that was the date that Schumacher spoke with Mac, and there's no mention of a cake at all. So Stephanie said she could have brought the Grahams a cake, but there was no truce. Bugliosi took Stephanie up to August 30th, and Stephanie said that she did not see Mac or Muff the entire day, that Buck had told her of the dinner invitation on the Sea Wind, that she was preparing for the Fanning trip, and that she didn't hear any kind of screaming. She didn't hear any kind of gunshots. She did not see fire or smoke. And they went on board, they being she and Buck, went on board the Sea Wind for the alleged dinner. They ate the snacks that were set out, and that the Grahams never returned to the Sea Wind. Stephanie told the story about going onto the Sea Wind. She said it was about 6:30 at night, that Buck was waiting outside the Sea Wind, and relayed that Mac said if they weren't back by 6:30 to go on board and make themselves at home, and she said, so we did. Stephanie said that there was drinks and cookies laid out, and that they waited topside for Mac and Muff to return. She said by 7 o'clock it was completely dark, and she became worried, so they turned on the Sea Wind's masthead light so that Mac and Muff could see in the dark coming back. She said that she dozed off and woke at dawn, woke Buck up, and they took the wooden dinghy that belonged to the Sea Wind to search for the couple. Buck was operating it, and they went right along the shore, and Stephanie spots the Zodiac, she said, a quarter to a half mile on the beach. Now note that this is a change in testimony. Allegedly, she had told Calvin Shishido that the Zodiac was found in the lagoon. But she now said it was 1.5 to 2 feet above the waterline, which would then line up with the scientific testimony that the motor had never been in the water. Then Stephanie said they found the gas tank from the dinghy, the Zodiac, I guess, and she thought it floated to shore, and that Buck reattached it to the dinghy, and then they used the Zodiac to then look for Mac and Muff. Now, I believe there was leftover gasoline on the atoll from when the Navy had been there. However, since we all know Buck was lazier than lazy, what if he used some of that can gasoline to use with the acetylene torch to burn the bodies? Because he's lazy, right? Stephanie then told of how they searched for 3 days looking for the couple, and they spent every night on the Sea Wind. You kind of wonder, when they still had the Iola and Buck still had his camp on the atoll, why in the world they spent the night on the Sea Wind, but I guess it was just convenient, right? I think she said if they came back to their boat, she wanted to be there and know about it. Bugliosi then brings forth testimony about her diary. And you know what? Anyone can write anything they want in a diary, right? Especially after the fact. I mean, no, there's nobody there, with metadata on a diary. So keep that in mind. And she writes on August 30th, quote, "And then tragedy. And overnight, a whole new set of alternatives beset us." Okay. Now he's questioning about these diary entries that go on for a few days, and she admits that she essentially backfilled the entries, that she didn't sit down on August 30th and write, "and then a tragedy, and overnight a whole new set of alternatives beset us." She wrote that probably on September 4th. So she's admitting to backfilling the entries. On September 4th, she allegedly wrote, quote, "And the decision to depart followed by a great deal of preparation, while we grow fatter and fatter on ham and cheese and pancakes and turkey and chili." And when questioned about this, because Bugliosi was trying to put everything negative out there and take the sting out of what the government was going to cross her on, right? So Stephanie admitted that entry on September 4th, at the end of a 3-day search for this missing couple, was quite callous. And she said she wanted to contact the authorities, but Buck got really mad. She said that Buck wanted to sail off on the Sea Wind, and that Buck said to her, kind of like a rationalization, that Mac would not want the Sea Wind to be vandalized. She said that Buck gave her 3 choices. And she said she loved Buck and she wanted to be with him, and that he wanted to take the Sea Wind to Hawaii and re-register her. And Stephanie claimed that she found an old will while searching the Sea Wind, signed by Mac, stating that if he was not married, see, this will was from 1960, before he was married to Muff, If he was not married, a person stipulated on another document was he hoped would take custody of the Sea Wind and give it a round the world cruise, and within 2 years following his death bring it back, and give it to his sister, to the estate. And that's true, there was a will, but it was before he was married. So it was like, if I am not married, well, he was married. So all this justification is just bunkum. So Stephanie rationalized, quote, "We were the only people there. There was nobody else on the island to get the boat any place except us." So Stephanie said she showed Buck the will and said she would go along with this as long as the Sea Wind was returned to Mary Munsey within 2 years. She claimed that she never planned to steal the Sea Wind and never intended to keep the Sea Wind. Now keep in mind, we talk about that salvage claim, right? So Bugliosi was like, uh-oh, the salvage claim. You claim you're never going to keep her. What's the salvage claim about, right? But he didn't know. He didn't know exactly what went down with that claim, right? And Stephanie said that while on Palmyra, Buck removed the Sea Wind name. So you gotta wonder, like, if you're intending to just take it back to the mainland, sail it around a little bit and take it back to the mainland, why are you gonna strip it? Why are you gonna do that, right? Stephanie testified that Buck towed the Iola out of the lagoon on the Sea Wind. Then, when they're both out of the lagoon, that he opened up the Iola's fittings. Obviously, he left that hatch on Palmyra, and they sank the Iola. And Stephanie then admitted to taking the photos. And I gotta say that there was previous testimony, remember, that she said that she didn't have any knowledge, or she essentially, in my opinion, lied about the photos at the theft trial. But now, of course, now that they're plainly there, and Bugliosi is trying to prove her innocent, actually, not just not guilty, he's trying to prove her innocent. So he's like finding anything that she lied about or been incorrect about or came out that nobody before knew about. He's going to try to take the sting out of it. So she admits to taking those photos of the sinking of the Iola. So she admits to lying to the FBI in previous testimony. She admits to sinking the Iola because she thought it would look bad. Lying about sinking it would look bad. Well, it would if you're trying to, that was the boat theft trial. So Stephanie admitted that she told lies to others as to how she and Buck obtained the Sea Wind, that she'd told various people varying stories. One, Buck had told about winning it in a chess game, and that she didn't encounter that, and that she had told another person that they got it because the guy was tired of maintaining it. Just different stories that she had lied about obtaining it. She talked about taking the Sea Wind into the tuna packers to fix the hole in the hull, and that they scraped the barnacles off, sanded the hull, and covered it with lavender paint over what had been blue paint. She said that Buck re-registered the boat, and that Stephanie said she did not want her name on those re-registration papers. Now you gotta wonder, she's now back on Hawaiian soil. Why didn't she now report the disappearance to the authorities? They could have run. They didn't have to stay on that boat. And she said, quote, "I couldn't do that without placing Buck in danger of being apprehended." And I gotta note, this entire time, from the first time that the Grahams did not allegedly show back up on the Sea Wind that fateful day, which I don't even think that's a day it happened. That's my opinion. But anyway, that whole entire time, these defendants could have used the ham radio. Now, I heard that Stephanie said that she didn't know how to use the ham radio. But Schumacher was calling and calling and calling the Sea Wind when the date was missed. Do you think that they, in 31 days that they're tooling around trying to get back to Hawaii on the Sea Wind, that they didn't have the time to try to figure out how a ham radio worked? You have this woman who doesn't know how to navigate, gets to Palmyra from Honolulu and can't figure out how to use a ham radio. Are you kidding me? Like, come on. And Bugliosi made massive hash, made a huge deal of Stephanie returning one of her buddies' laundry while they were in harbor, and Buck spots the Coast Guard, and he jumps into the water, and Stephanie ran, but then she went to put the dogs backside and returned some laundry really quick, and then she did a full runner, okay? But it was like, oh, she can't be that guilty because she returned some dude's laundry. I mean, it's like, it's stupid, okay? It's stupid, but a lot of hash is made to try to prove some like innate innocence because she stopped to put the dogs back under, not top side but bottom side, and returned some dumb laundry. I mean, it's just dumb. She did a runner just like Buck. It just, she got caught. Oh, and remember that letter that Buck had written to Kit Muncie, allegedly while they were on their way to bring the Seawind to Honolulu, and it's talking about the salvage claim and bup. And, you know, he was trying to say it was written while they were in dry dock, not in jail. Well, Stephanie admitted to Bugliosi that while Buck was in jail, he wrote that letter and gave it to her to mail to Kit Muncie. So, I mean, it's like, where does it end? In my opinion, where does the cover-up end? So Bugliosi had found the information about the salvage claim that a previous attorney, she, I guess, tried to say that it was the attorney's idea or something. But yeah, you can see the newspaper article here about the salvage claim, and that he said that it was in the newspapers, but that Stephanie told him the claim never went to court. Okay? The government begins cross-examining Stephanie. And Inoki asked her about the golden figurehead that was a bowsprit on the Seawind. That's at the front of the boat, like a statue. And she said she didn't remember seeing it after they left Palmyra. So I gotta wonder, is that someplace on Palmyra? Or did it get taken off and then dumped once they hit the blue water? I don't know. Buck seemingly removed all the names of the Seawind and put the name Iola on it while they were still on Palmyra. Inoki asked Stephanie if she had, I guess, worn Muff's clothes, and Bugliosi said she even sounded peevish when answering, and then she was shown, I believe this is one of the pictures, and allegedly this is Muff's blouse, according to the family. Inoki asked Stephanie about a witness statement that she had allegedly told a Mrs. Wallen that they were going to the South Seas, that was their next destination. And she said she didn't recall that. He got her to admit that she would not have left Palmyra on the Seawind unless she was absolutely positive that both Mac and Muff had died. And then the government had a rebuttal witness, and it was on an FBI 302 form that wasn't turned over in discovery. And we all know that's a no-no. You don't do that. So this didn't actually get in front of the jury. Let's get into this little tidbit. Allegedly, there was a person named George Gordon, and he must have gone to the FBI and told them this information because it was on an FBI 302 form. And he said that he met Stephanie Stearns at a bar on the Big Island, and they were drinking. And this is obviously after they got back, and she had been arrested for the boat theft and before she went on trial, I believe. So he said the following 6 or 7 things. 1, that Stephanie told him she was scared and insecure on Palmyra. 2, that she wanted to leave the atoll. 3, that she was afraid the Iola would sink. 4, that she wanted to leave with the Grahams, but was either denied or refused. He wasn't sure exactly the status of that, but that she wanted to leave with the Grahams. 5, that the two couples didn't get along. And 6, if Buck spilled his guts, she would be in a lot of trouble. Bugliosi puts this in his book, but the jury didn't hear any of it. Inoki asked Stephanie directly about the radio communications, the ham radio. Obviously, Schumacher would have been calling in, and that she was aware that those radio communications would no longer be replied to by the Grahams as she and Buck were on the Seawind. She said, yeah, she realized that. That's essentially that line of questioning, but Stephanie admitted that she did not use the radio and that she did not know how to use the ham radio. Inoki also brought out some really good points. He elicited from Stephanie, looking at her diary that now has been put into evidence, that had things noted like when they went fishing, who they saw that day, even when she had fights with Buck, little rows with Buck. This is all noted. But there was nothing in Stephanie Stearns' diary about the fights regarding leaving on the Seawind. So she'll put down about fighting with Buck about some random thing, but she's getting into arguments about leaving on the Seawind or not leaving on the Seawind, and that's not put into the diary. That's backdated. And Inoki flat out asked her, but by August 30th, essentially, were you tired of living on Palmyra? And she said, if I had my choice of some place to go, I would not choose Palmyra, ... Palmyra was not my favorite place to be. Inoki also showed Stephanie some of her diary entries from the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th, where she said they only had coconuts. And then on the 25th, she was kind of sarcastically excited because they got to eat some beans instead of coconuts. And then he let her, kind of let her into the irony of baking a cake for a couple that has everything they need on a boat before they leave for fanning on the 28th. Like, who would do that? You're eating coconuts day after day after day, and then you have a can of beans on the 25th, and it's the diary entry. Great, beans. And then you're going to use all your precious stores, to bake a cake for a couple that has everything. And even Bugliosi was taken aback when the judge directly asked Stephanie some questions. And some courts do this, and one of which was, did you take a cake to the Seawind on August 28th? I mean, just cut through the chase and asked her. And she turned to the judge and said it could have happened, but she didn't put it in her diary. And she said that Mac had loaned them the fanning chart and that she could have baked them a cake as a thank you. Her diary entry had shown that Mac had brought the fanning chart over on August 26th. And Stephanie Stearns told the judge she simply could not remember going to the Seawind on August 28th. Now, to me, that's just stunning, because that's the last time that anyone heard from Mac and essentially Muff Graham. He's on the Seawind. He's got his twice weekly call with Schumacher. He's talking with Schumacher, and he hears, I wouldn't say a ruckus, but he hears voices, and he's like, oh, okay. So he goes, hold on a second. I think I hear somebody coming. It had to have been Stephanie and Buck, because there's the only other people on the atoll. He goes up there, and he hears, he hears women's voices, and he's like, oh, something about, I think they brought a cake over. It must be a truce, implying that they weren't getting along. And so he's like, everything must be fine. They brought a cake over, and he went back and ended the conversation. And that's the last anybody had heard of them. And now Stephanie's saying she doesn't even remember going over there on the 28th. So now we're going to go into the closing arguments. And for Bugliosi, it was really important for him to get every minute. The judge allowed him 5 hours, and he wanted more. And so he had to cut his final summation down to the bare bones. But he did a really, really good job. Since the government was arguing first-degree murder, that Stephanie Stearns was responsible for the first-degree murder of Eleanor Muff Graham, that it required not only malice aforethought, but premeditation. So they're going to go through a lot of different elements of that, which we're not going to do here. But essentially, they're going to argue that Buck killed Muff, and Jennifer was at least an accomplice. She aided and abetted Buck in any way if she did this in the murder of Mac and Muff, even inducing or even convincing Buck that she is then also responsible. They brought up circumstantial evidence that she assisted the fugitive when he fled Hawaii, that she used her money, her time, and her labor to escape with this fugitive on Iola. She traveled thousands of miles without knowing navigation to help this fugitive. The government said that she never was aboard the Sea Wind. They said that, the diary showed that she never was aboard the Sea Wind, and that witnesses had testified that the couple were low on supplies, that the food shortage was an issue, that they were worried that they weren't getting resupplied, that the Iola was unseaworthy. Many witnesses testified to that. It had cracks in the hull. They were bilging it out, some people said daily, and that it stood no chance of going to fanning against the wind and against the current. And they brought up many statements that Stephanie had allegedly made, that she would never leave Palmyra on the Iola. And then how's she going to leave Palmyra, right? He showed an August 5th diary entry of her own writing. The couple spent the night, quote, drooling and dreaming about their next boat. Inoki said that the witnesses had testified that the couples were clearly not getting along. He brought up Muff crying to Marilyn Pollock about the situation, being terrified that the Pollocks left, essentially because they were nervous, and that the last person who spoke to Mac had said that they had visitors, cake and a truce. And, no one ever heard from Mac or Muff again after that. And he said the cake was almost like a peace offering to get on board, almost like a Trojan horse, and that the diary was written after the fact to cover up a crime. And essentially asked, how did Buck do this alone? And he just goes through a laundry list. Find both the Grahams, kill both the Grahams, burn Muff's head with an acetylene torch from Mac's workshop, get 2 aluminum cargo containers from the rescue boat, and take one cargo container and put Muff in it, and take the other cargo container and put Mac in it, and find wire to wrap around the containers and weigh down the containers, and burn Muff in a container for 15 to 20 minutes, and then navigate the bodies one by one, and maybe in the Zodiac down to the lagoon to dump them. And all this goes on, and Stephanie doesn't hear anything, she doesn't see anything, she doesn't smell anything. It doesn't make any sense. Inoki said that the prosecution could not prove how Miss Graham was killed or exactly what role Stearns played, but he said that Stephanie had the same motive for murder as did Walker, to get a yacht in place of their own leaky boat and get off that island. And he brings up the diary entry about how we have all grown fatter and fatter on ham, cheese, turkey, and chili, and all the things we've not had for so long. So Inoki countered Stephanie's hippie image, showing that she knew Buck was a convicted armed robber, and that she knew that he had guns, that she knew he had an explosive personality, kept booby traps on the Big Island, that she was 28 years old, an intelligent woman. And he alleged that what happened on Palmyra and her testimony was a continuous stream of lies about the events on Palmyra that she told and has told ever since she left the island. He said she lied about how they got the sea wind. She lied about where the Zodiac was found. She lied about running the Iola on the reef on the way out. She lied about the pics taken on the sea wind showing the Iola's last voyage, essentially sinking. She altered her testimony to suit the evidence. She didn't alert authorities to the disappearance of the Grahams. She allegedly mailed Walker's bogus letter that he wrote from jail to Kit Muncie. She had motive to kill, to steal the Sea Wind and the supplies aboard the Sea Wind. She took $400 and wore Muff's clothes. She dated even another man who shot and killed someone in California. She wasn't a hippie chick, is what he argued. And Muff was dead, Mac is seemingly dead, and the 2 people that left that atoll have the victim's boat. Inoki was arguing circumstantial evidence. Now, Vincent Bugliosi's closing on behalf of Stephanie Stearns was 5 hours long, and it was amazing. Go read The Sea and the Sea Will Tell, and you will get the whole entire closing argument. He begins arguing the law. The burden of proof is with the prosecution. The burden of proof never shifts to the defendant. And he mentions that the mere presence at the scene of the crime and knowledge that a crime is being committed are not sufficient to establish that the defendant, Stephanie Stearns, aided and abetted the crime. Bugliosi also argued that some of the witnesses, the Pollocks and Kurt Schumacher, slanted their testimony. For example, regarding Schumacher, if the cake truce happened, he argued that Schumacher would have told the authorities right away about that conversation. And he only mentioned the cake, but not the truce. And, he didn't mention that at the boat theft trial. So Bugliosi argued that even if a cake truce had taken place, all it proved is that the Grahams and Buck and Stephanie were in each other's presence. Bugliosi also argued that there was no scientific examinations of the sea wind put into evidence, things about the swordfish incident, because, there was nothing put into the evidence from the sea wind. And he reminded the jury that Larry Siebert, that was one of the witnesses who was friends with Stephanie and Buck, said he saw this bill stuck in the hole of the sea wind. And that also another witness had spoken that Stephanie and Buck had recounted the swordfish incident. Bugliosi also argued about the Pollocks as witnesses, that they slanted their testimony and that they only came up with the toilet flushing story in the previous years running up to this trial. Edwin had said that he just assumed the FBI already knew about all the flushing because they were also outside the restroom. See, Edwin had the key, so that explains that. Bugliosi also attacked the statement that Stephanie had allegedly said that she would not leave Palmyra on the Iola. And, he again said that their statements were slanted because they had not told anyone this before. He then talked about the Iola's seaworthiness and all the witnesses that had been put forth saying it was unseaworthy. And he said the question is not whether the Iola was truly seaworthy or not. The question is whether Buck and Stephanie thought it was seaworthy. So he's talking about their state of mind, and he points to her diary entries that he's put into evidence to prove she was preparing for fanning for many days. Bugliosi then goes in about the desperation for food motive in hurting the Grahams, taking the sea wind. He calls it lame and flimsy, that obviously the atoll could sustain human life. They were not starving. They did not kill to improve their diet. And, he talks about their state of mind. They have enough food there. But by that same token, the previous argument about state of mind could be used. I could say, well, it's not whether Palmyra didn't have enough food. It's whether Buck and Stephanie thought it was enough. You could turn that right around, but Inoki didn't do that. Bugliosi said that Buck Walker was tailor-made to commit these murders all by himself. And Bugliosi likened, you're going to love this, he likened Stephanie to Ava Braun and Buck to Hitler. And he says, well, nobody blames Ava. So, Bugliosi, he is a born storyteller, but that one got me kind of like, okay. Bugliosi argued that everything Stephanie Stearns did was for two reasons. One, because she loved Buck Walker, and two, because she was trying to protect him from apprehension. And then he made the case that Buck did it essentially, that he argued that Buck fabricated the dinner invite, that did not make sense for the Grahams to serve Stephanie and Buck fish as a bon voyage dinner when they usually served other guests meat, which absolutely makes sense. That was a good point. That Buck had been living on shore and Stephanie did not know his doings that day. Buck had left out apricot brandy, which just happened to be Stephanie's favorite. Bugliosi also argued that the circumstantial evidence is that Buck did not use his gun, but instead blunt force trauma, that Buck would have tossed the gun had he used it out in the blue water once they got there. I would also argue maybe not, because what gun would he have then other than Mac's guns, right? A wanted man like Buck, who's violent's not going to want to toss his good firearm. But anyway, Bugliosi argued that even if Buck did shoot Muff in the head and it was a contact wound, then a million birds squawking would have kept Stephanie from hearing it. Bugliosi then goes on to argue Stephanie's innocence. Not just not guilty, she's innocent. He argues everything, and I'll let you read the book, but let me give you an overview. 1, she testified when she could have remained silent. 2, that all the witnesses they put forth on the stand testified to her non-violent character. It was almost like her personality trait, he said. Also, her diary that he put into evidence had said that it was, quote-unquote, a tragedy. Additionally, that she had kept up a picture of Mac and Muff in the Seawind, and when someone asked about it, she showed them and said that they were the previous owners of the boat. And then he brings that whole laundry story in to show how innocent, the Coast Guard's bearing down on her, and little innocent Stephanie's bringing the laundry back. His closing statement was truly a work of art, and I have not done it justice here. On February 28, 1986, the jury deadlocked 6-6 after 2 days of deliberations, and Judge King sent them back for more deliberations. I believe they call that the Allen charge. The judge told them that a jury in a retrial would have no more information and invited those holdouts to reconsider the opposing argument. So he sent them back to deliberate. Eventually, a unanimous verdict was reached. And this article says Bugliosi cradled Stearns in a vain effort to shield her from the bad news. He was in the midst of apologizing to her when the foreman entered the words "not guilty" instead. Stephanie told the reporters, after hugging her tearful parents, "It's been grueling. My faith in the American judicial system has been reinstated." So Stephanie Stearns was found not guilty of the murder of Eleanor Muff Graham. Now, one could argue that not guilty could also mean that the state didn't prove its case, right? And I would agree. Maybe the state didn't have enough evidence to prove their case. So then Vincent Bugliosi, aided by Bruce Henderson, wrote "And the Sea Will Tell," which became a bestseller. In 1991, Bugliosi said, "I'm satisfied that my client was not involved in the Palmyra murder. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, however, tell me that she was really the brains behind the killings. I got lots of nasty letters after the book came out from women telling me Stearns had pulled the wool over my eyes, and they said I didn't understand what women are capable of." The television rights were sold for approximately $1.1 million, and in 1991, a 4-hour CBS made-for-TV miniseries with Rachel Ward as Stephanie Stearns — he calls her Jennifer Jenkins in the book, by the way — and James Brolin as Buck, and Richard Crenna as Bugliosi, was filmed in Hawaii and Tahiti, and I believe the courtroom scenes were filmed in Vancouver, Canada. And for the book, Bugliosi and Bruce Henderson again changed the names of his client, and it's a really good mini-series, and sometimes you can find it uploaded on YouTube, okay? Sometimes people here and there put it up, and I watch it every time. It's wonderful. In fact, my dad had taped it on a VCR tape, and I watched it so much while I was in my first year of law school, actually my only year of law school, that I broke the VCR tape. I would just keep it on as I went through briefs and stuff. It was crazy. It was literally crazy how much I watched this. It's really good. And Bugliosi noted that he had tenuous contact with Stephanie after the verdict. He says, "She sends me a Christmas card every year, And it says Merry Christmas, and that's it. He goes, I don't know what she's thinking. And then Buck self-publishes a book, and that's going to be the final chapter to try to tie all this stuff together with what Buck admits to. Oh, Lord have mercy. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned for part 7, and that's it. It won't be that long, by the way. If you found this enlightening, if you like this kind of stuff, please sub to my channel, push that like button, leave a comment in the comment section below, and without further ado, have an excellent day.